Many of you, when you visited Nassau in February for the opening of the Heads of Government Conference in that month, may have seen the giant hotel project going up next door to that venue. We had plans to open that facility within months of the conference. Instead, the developer was unable to deliver on the promise of the opening, and a bitter set of recriminations began in the public domain about who was at fault. The government felt compelled in the national interest to step into the middle of this dispute, given the fact that some 2,000 young people had been taken on in anticipation of this opening, and the fact that some $3 billion had been invested, $2.6 billion in Chinese capital from its Export-Import Bank, $700 million of the developer's money, and another $100 million from the China Construction Company. In the language of the Americans, this was too big to fail. Yet, despite the good faith efforts of the government and its best endeavors, the developer chose instead to file for bankruptcy of the project in the American courts, where the companies who own the project are registered. This was done without notice and with the developer sitting at the table on the face of it seeking a settlement. As often happens, everyone has now become an expert on what should have been done and what should not have been done. But suffice it to say that the Prime Minister believes that this project has to succeed and is working to ensure that it does. What it raises, however, is more generally the vulnerability of our societies, not only to the shocks of weather and climate, but to the size and singularity of economic projects driven by foreign direct investment and sometimes our own internal investments. When there is a crisis, we have no reserve currencies to be able to have quantitative easing, another expression for printing money to ensure liquidity in the system. These kinds of shocks have resulted in many cases in the high indebtedness that we face today. Think of the various issues or crises in our region. The banker who had plenty to say to our region, who lectured our leaders like they were in school, who was thought by many to be a model investor, a good guy, only to end up in the American jails and leaving the CARICOM country and its citizens holding the bag. Or the housing and mortgage bubble in one of our countries, where because of speculation by private investors, the market collapsed and the CARICOM country had to absorb all of its reserve currency to protect the savings of the citizens of that country. Or the giant insurance company that stretched its tentacles from the Bahamas to Trinidad and Tobago, paying super excellent returns on investment, only to collapse in a heap, leaving the governments again to hold the bag while the investor walked away into the sunset. This, in our view, shows that notwithstanding all that is said, and whatever the fashion, at the end of the day, governments still have a major role to play in the resilience of our societies and their abilities to adapt to the shocks of and vagaries of the world economy and our natural conditions. It is imperative, then, for our public administrations and our political directorates to be trained and up to the mark, adequately prepared for the slings and arrows of outrageous fortune. I was a much younger man when I heard a speech in Miami by the late Errol Barrow, and he, reacting to the election fashions of his time, following the defeat of the Democratic Socialists in the region, excoriated the trend by describing those who looked north for solace and rescue rather than to self-reliance as, quote, groveling mendicants with their caps in their hands. We are too polite in this time to make those kinds of statements, but I think that we get the point that when failure takes place, it is to the governments of the region that our people look to for help, assistance, and rescue. No other entity. It is to the leaders and to the politicians. Our task today is to reassure the region that come what may, our governments, their elected officials, have the intellectual acuity, the intestinal fortitude to help rescue our nations, and I am confident that we do.